In 1940, as Nazi forces tore through Europe, the French Republic turned to its colonies, not for diplomacy, not for debate, but for bodies. Thousands of young African men were taken from Senegal, Mali, Chad, and across French West and Central Africa. Some volunteered under the weight of promises. Others were coerced. Most didn't understand the full picture. But what they knew was this: the colonizers needed soldiers, and the colonized were expected to obey. These men were called the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, though many were not Senegalese. It was a blanket term used by the French to describe the black soldiers from across their African colonies. For the French, these soldiers were useful. They were cheaper, considered more physically fit for harsh conditions, and above all, they were expendable. From the very beginning, the Africans were treated differently. When they arrived in Europe, many experienced cold for the first time. Snow fell from skies they had never seen before. Some wore light uniforms in winter. Some weren't given boots. French officers kept a distance, socially and militarily. Instructions were shouted in languages the colonized barely understood. Still, orders were followed. These men had been taught to respect command or face punishment. Then came the battles. As the Germans advanced, panic spread across France. The French army was collapsing under the weight of Hitler's blitzkrieg. Morale was low. Desperation was high. And in this chaos, a disturbing strategy took form. In frontline combat, the French command began placing African soldiers at the most dangerous positions. They were sent ahead to draw fire, to force enemy positions to reveal themselves, to take the first wave of bullets and bombs. The colonized were not just on the front lines, they were the front lines. One battlefield in particular tells the story clearly: the Loire River, June 1940. As the Germans approached, French officers deployed regiments of tirailleurs across a series of rural hedge fields. These hedges were thick, sometimes taller than a man. Behind them, snipers could hide. Mines could be buried. But instead of sending scouts or reconnaissance teams, the French ordered the African soldiers to walk straight through. One step after another, no cover, no support. Those who made it through were shot by German machine guns. Those who hesitated were shouted at, threatened, even struck by French officers. Why them? The colonizers would say it was strategy. But strategy without value for life is not war. It's sacrifice. The hedge fields became graveyards. Dozens of African men fell within minutes. French officers stood back, taking note, watching for signs of German fire. Once the enemy revealed their position, the French artillery would respond. Not to save the colonized, but to avenge their usefulness. Back home in West Africa, families waited for letters. Some never came. Some came late. Vague notices of death in combat. Few names were recorded correctly. In some cases, the colonized weren't even buried. Their bodies were left in fields, anonymous in foreign soil. One survivor, years later, told his son, "We were used like cattle. They sent us to die, so they didn't have to." That man, a young recruit from present-day Burkina Faso, had lost 2 brothers in a single night. He saw them fall beside him. He asked for help. No one came. When he returned from the war, his village celebrated, but his silence lasted a lifetime. It wasn't just on the battlefield. In camps, the colonized were given less food. They were paid less. They were insulted openly by their French superiors. Racial slurs were common. Some French soldiers refused to share tents or sit at the same table. The African troops slept in muddy corners, ate scraps, and still marched in line, still saluted, still served. Then came the fall of France. As the Germans overran Paris, many African regiments were captured. Some were executed on sight. German officers viewed black soldiers not just as enemies, but as racial threats. In several recorded incidents, groups of tirailleurs were separated from white soldiers and massacred. In Chasselet, near Lyon, over 50 African prisoners were rounded up by the Nazis and shot, their bodies buried in mass graves. The French locals were too terrified to intervene. Those who did were silenced. Those who weren't killed by the Germans faced another betrayal. After France surrendered and was divided under German control, the African soldiers who remained in French custody were no longer useful. Some were imprisoned by their own commanders. Others were shipped back to Africa without medals, without compensation, and without the truth. And yet, even after all this, the story did not end. Years later, when the war was over, a few surviving veterans gathered the courage to demand recognition. They wrote letters to French officials. They requested pensions, just like white French soldiers received. The response was silence, delay, rejection. One letter from a former colonized soldier was returned unopened. Another was met with a polite notice. No record of your service exists. In 1944, in a town called Tirailleurs in Senegal, the tension reached its breaking point. Hundreds of demobilized African soldiers gathered in protest. They had been promised payment for their service. The money never came. They demanded it peacefully. The French response was violent. At night, French troops opened fire on the unarmed veterans. Dozens were killed. It was called a mutiny, but it was a massacre. This story, like so many others, was buried under medals and ceremonies. The French celebrated their resistance, their liberation, their suffering under Nazi rule. But the suffering of the colonized was forgotten, or worse, erased. To this day, there are streets in France named after generals who ordered African men to the front lines. Museums celebrate victories that were built on colonial blood. Meanwhile, in dusty villages across Africa, widows still remember the day the recruiter came. They remember the day their sons left, wearing stiff uniforms and carrying rifles they didn't know how to use. Some never returned. Others returned, but never spoke again. This is not just a story about war. It's about betrayal. It's about how empires use people, then forget them. It's about the cost of silence. But the story is far from over. What happened to those who survived? How did the colonized continue to serve a country that denied them? Why did it take over 60 years for France to offer a formal apology? And what about the graves? Those left unnamed, unmarked, and uncared for. Those answers are coming. Because the colonized did not fight for glory. The colonized fought because the colonizers demanded it. And that truth must be told. After the war ended, Europe began to rebuild. Cities were cleared of rubble, flags were raised, and stories of resistance spread across the newspapers. The colonizers told tales of bravery, of French resilience, of victory against the odds. But for the colonized, there was no celebration, only waiting. In the towns and villages of West Africa, families gathered under trees and in crowded squares, hoping for letters, medals, money, or at least news. Many received none. Mothers who had given up sons waited in silence. Widows who never married wept in private. In some villages, entire groups of men had vanished, and only rumors returned. No graves, no records, no return. The French government had promised pensions to the African soldiers. Contracts had been signed. Agreements had been made in military offices across the colonies. But when the war was over, those promises became paper. The colonized were told there were budget problems, administrative delays, missing files. Some were forced to wait not months, but years. Others never received a single franc. In 1944, the truth began to crack open. Hundreds of African veterans were gathered in the French base of Thiaroye, just outside Dakar. These were men who had fought and survived. Men who had seen combat in Italy, in France, in Germany. Men who had watched their brothers fall beside them. They had been told they would finally receive their back pay before returning home. But the French authorities hesitated. They claimed the amount was too high. They said it would cause unrest. Some officials accused the colonized of being ungrateful. So, the veterans waited. Days passed. No money. No explanations. Just rumors and fear. On the night of December 1st, 1944, the silence was broken. French troops surrounded the camp. Shots were fired into the darkness. Machine guns lit the sky. In minutes, over 30 African veterans were dead. Some say the number was higher. Official records remain unclear. The French called it a rebellion, but it was not. It was a protest, met with bullets. The massacre at Thiaroye was covered up. For years, it was barely mentioned in French history. It didn't appear in textbooks. It wasn't discussed in schools. Even in Senegal, the event was whispered about, not written. Families of the victims were told to remain quiet. Some were threatened. Others were simply ignored. The surviving veterans lived in the shadows. They returned to their farms, their markets, their dusty roads. Some walked with limp legs. Some carried wounds that never healed. Others carried memories that burned deeper than any scar. They had served, fought, and bled for a country that had called them inferior. And when they asked for dignity, they were punished. But the silence did not last forever. In the 1970s and 80s, a few journalists and historians began to investigate. They found survivors. They found letters. They found the quiet rage that still burned in the hearts of the colonized. Slowly, testimonies began to surface. African veterans spoke in trembling voices. They described the fear, the betrayals, the empty promises. One former soldier from Guinea said, "The French taught us discipline, but gave us shame." In France, the government remained defensive. Apologies were vague. Denials were common. When asked why African veterans were paid less than their white counterparts, officials blamed technical differences. They spoke of currencies, conversions, and paperwork. But the colonized knew the truth. It was never about math. It was about race. By the 1990s, international pressure mounted. Human rights groups, scholars, and African leaders demanded answers. French television aired short documentaries. Questions were asked in parliament. But recognition was still slow. Some payments were made, small amounts, decades too late. Many veterans were already dead. Others were too old to understand what had changed. One former tirailleur in Mali, by then blind and nearly 90, was handed a check by a visiting official. He asked, "Will this bring back my brother?" In 2006, over 60 years after the war, the French president gave a public speech acknowledging the discrimination. It was framed as an effort to correct history. But no correction can restore a stolen life. No ceremony can erase decades of silence. And even now, the graves of African soldiers lie forgotten in corners of France, unmarked, overgrown, lost under weeds and stone. But the memories live on. Children of the colonized, in Senegal, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, have started to tell the stories their fathers couldn't. Young filmmakers, writers, and teachers have begun to bring these names back from the dark. In schoolyards and classrooms, new generations are learning that the face of World War II was not only white. That liberation came on the backs of the oppressed. That some fought for freedom they were never allowed to taste. Still, questions remain. Why did the French continue to send African troops into wars long after independence? What role did the tirailleurs play in conflicts like Indochina and Algeria? What happened to the families of the murdered veterans in Thiaroye? Were they ever compensated? Or were they erased, like so many others? And deeper still, how did the colonized manage to survive not just war, but erasure? What does dignity look like after betrayal? How many more graves remain unmarked? The story of the African soldiers is not over. Their blood built roads no one remembers. Their sacrifice fed an empire that left them hungry. But their memory is returning, not because the colonizers offered it, but because the colonized demand it. There are still voices to hear, still records to open, still truth to speak. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the rifles rusted, the war continued inside the minds of the colonized. In villages across West Africa, the veterans carried something heavier than medals: silence. Speaking about the battlefield was dangerous. Speaking about betrayal was even more dangerous. The colonizers still ruled. Administrators still controlled land, taxes, and movement. Remembering too loudly could bring punishment. Many former African soldiers were watched closely after returning home. French colonial authorities feared rebellion. A trained soldier who had seen Europe, who had witnessed weakness in the empire, was considered a threat. Some veterans were denied work. Others were labeled troublemakers. A few disappeared after questioning officials about missing pay or dead comrades. Yet memory has a way of surviving even under pressure. In family gatherings, stories were told quietly at night. Fathers spoke in fragments. An ambush near a river. A march through snow. A French officer shouting orders no one understood. Mothers remembered the day recruiters arrived, boots polished, papers stamped, promises flowing easily. Young men were told France was the mother country. That loyalty would be rewarded. That service meant honor. Honor never came. By the 1950s, the world was changing. Colonies were beginning to resist openly. Independence movements grew louder across Africa and Asia. And among the voices calling for freedom were former tirailleurs, men who had learned how empires fight, how empires lie, and how empires fall. Some veterans joined independence movements in Senegal, Guinea, and Mali. Others trained younger fighters. The colonized were no longer naive. The myth of equality within the empire had collapsed on the battlefields of Europe. The same French who spoke of liberty had placed African soldiers in front of machine guns. That contradiction could not be unlearned. Still, France continued to use African soldiers even after World War II. In Indochina, the colonized were sent again to fight, this time against Vietnamese independence fighters. Once more, African troops were placed in dangerous terrain. Once more, promises were made. Once more, bodies returned without explanation. The cycle repeated itself. When Algeria erupted into war in the 1950s, African soldiers were again present, fighting for a colonizer against another colonized people. Some refused orders. Some deserted. Others followed commands, trapped between discipline and conscience. The empire depended on this division. The colonizers understood one thing clearly. Oppressed people could be used to control other oppressed people. This strategy left deep scars. Former soldiers struggled with guilt. Some had fought civilians. Some had enforced colonial rule against people who looked like them. The empire did not just steal bodies, it twisted identities. The colonized were forced into roles that haunted them long after the guns fell silent. Meanwhile, in France, memory remained selective. War memorials showed white faces carved in stone. School lessons praised generals and resistance fighters. The African soldier appeared rarely, if at all, often reduced to a footnote. When mentioned, the colonized were described as loyal helpers, not victims, not thinkers, not human beings with agency and pain. This absence was deliberate. Acknowledging the full truth would mean admitting that the French Republic survived partly because African lives were spent cheaply. It would mean confronting racism not as an accident, but as policy. And so the silence continued, protected by bureaucracy, softened by time. But time did not erase everything. In the early 2000s, families of deceased veterans began demanding access to military archives. Some were denied. Others received files with missing pages, names misspelled, causes of death listed vaguely as disappeared or killed in action, with no further detail. Graves were impossible to locate. Entire lives reduced to administrative errors. Yet even fragments were enough. Each recovered name became an act of resistance. Each testimony recorded broke another layer of silence. Documentaries emerged. Films like Indogenes forced French audiences to confront uncomfortable truths. For the first time, many in Europe saw African soldiers not as symbols, but as men, afraid, brave, exploited. Public pressure grew. France adjusted pensions again. Speeches were made. Wreaths were laid. But symbolic gestures could not undo generations of neglect. Many descendants of the colonized asked a simple question: why did recognition come only after death? And still, the deeper questions remain untouched. Why were African troops considered expendable? Why were German war crimes against black soldiers rarely prosecuted? Why were massacres like Thiaroye hidden for decades? And how many similar stories never reached daylight? Across Africa, the memory of World War II lives differently. Not as a story of liberation, but as a lesson. The colonized learned that empires speak of values while practicing violence. That loyalty is rewarded with silence. That history, when written by power, leaves out the wounded. Yet the descendants of those soldiers are no longer waiting quietly. In classrooms, students ask questions their grandparents were afraid to ask. In villages, names are spoken aloud again. In digital spaces, the erased are being remembered. The story is changing hands. But remembrance is only the beginning. Justice has not yet been fully addressed. Archives remain sealed. Graves remain unnamed. Families remain uncompensated. And the psychological damage, the sense of being used and discarded, continues to echo across generations. This is not just history. This is inheritance. And the next chapter does not belong to the colonizers. It belongs to those who remember. The war ended. The uniforms were packed away, but the conflict continued inside the homes, bodies, and memories of the colonized. For many veterans, returning home did not mean peace. It meant exile from recognition, rejection from the land they had bled for, and confusion about who they had become. The colonized had been told they were French, trained to salute the tricolor, to sing French anthems, to fight for liberté, égalité, fraternité. But on returning to Africa, the colonized were not embraced as French. And in France, they were never accepted as equals. The colonized existed in between, no longer fully part of the motherland, and no longer innocent of the empire's wars. This identity crisis ran deep. For the colonized, the war created a crack between what was promised and what was lived. The medals felt heavy, not with pride, but with betrayal. The uniforms reminded them not of glory, but of manipulation. Some never wore them again. Others kept them hidden, wrapped in cloth, tucked into wooden boxes buried behind family homes, not out of shame, but as a quiet protest. The next generation began to ask questions. Children of the colonized heard whispers. Their fathers woke up shouting in the night. Some sat for hours in silence, staring into the distance. Others snapped at small sounds, at fireworks, at sudden movement. Words like Europe, officers, orders, became landmines in conversation. The children knew not to ask too much. But silence does not protect forever. One daughter of a former tirailleur in Dakar described how, as a child, she once found an old picture, her father in uniform, standing next to a French officer. She asked, "Was this a friend?" Her father replied, "No. That was a man who decided who would live and who would die." The psychological toll did not end with the veterans. Their children inherited the weight, confusion, resentment, pride mixed with bitterness. For some, their family's history in the French army became a mark of shame. For others, it was a quiet badge of strength, proof that the colonized had survived what they were never meant to. But history can only stay buried for so long. By the 2010s, the movement to reclaim the story of the African soldiers had reached new ground. Scholars across Africa and the diaspora began publishing work on the tirailleurs. Journalists uncovered classified documents. Families brought legal cases against the French government. Memorial events were held in Senegal, Mali, Chad, not to glorify war, but to demand recognition. In Paris, protests were held outside military archives, demanding transparency. In Marseille, murals of forgotten African veterans appeared on street walls. In Bamako and Conakry, elders began recording testimonies, not just for textbooks, but for memory, for dignity, for truth. Social media brought a new weapon, visibility. Young Africans posted photos of their grandfathers in uniform, asking simple questions that shook the ground beneath old narratives. Why did France use our ancestors and then erase them? Where are the names on the monuments? Why did my grandfather die poor after serving in a European war? The colonizers could no longer control the story. One by one, the myths began to fall. The myth that African soldiers were volunteers by choice. The myth that they were treated equally in battle. The myth that France liberated the oppressed without using the oppressed to do it. These were not small corrections. These were truths that shifted the foundation of national memory. Still, resistance remained. Some French officials continued to call the story complicated. Some said it was inappropriate to reopen old wounds. But the colonized knew the wounds were never closed. And no apology could be meaningful without action. The demand became clear: full disclosure of records, proper compensation to families, accurate historical education, and national memorials that name every African who fought and died. A memorial with no name is not a tribute. It is a second burial. And what about the African veterans who settled in France? Their lives were no easier. Many lived in poor housing. Some worked as janitors, street cleaners, guards. They were denied full citizenship for years. In one heartbreaking case, a 90-year-old former tirailleur who had served France in World War II was refused a residency permit because he hadn't contributed enough to French society. When this reached the press, public outrage forced the government to reverse the decision. But it raised a deeper question. How can a man who risked his life for France be told he does not belong? The answer lay not in paperwork, but in the structure of the colonial mind. The colonizers never truly saw the colonized as equals. Not in 1940, not in 1960, not even now. That is why the colonized were placed at the front. That is why their pay was lower. That is why their graves remain unmarked. And that is why their stories are only now being heard, told not by the colonizers, but by the descendants of the forgotten. But even in forgetting, resistance grew. Memory became an act of rebellion. Truth became a weapon. Each time a name is remembered, a monument unveiled, a book published, the colonized reclaim not just the past, but the right to define their own future. This story continues. There are still graves to be found, families to be compensated, lessons to be taught. There are still veterans living in silence. Still photographs hidden in drawers. Still medals gathering dust in homes where honor was never given. But the silence has cracked. The stories are being told. And the world is listening. The story of the African soldiers used by the French during World War II is not a side note in history. It is not a complicated chapter. It is the foundation of an uncomfortable truth, one that the colonizers spent decades trying to bury. But history does not stay buried. It returns in memories, in whispers, in bloodlines. The colonized were called to fight in a war that was not theirs. Promised respect, they received silence. Promised citizenship, they were left stateless. Promised brotherhood, they were given bullets and betrayal. Their names are not carved into the stone walls of French memorials. Their graves are not marked with flowers and flags. Their children were not taught their stories in school. But this silence ends here. It ends with this video. It ends with every name we speak aloud. It ends with every viewer who refuses to let this truth fade again. Because the story of the colonized in World War II is not just a tale of pain. It is a story of resilience, of dignity in the face of empire, of men who walked into battle for a country that never intended to remember them. And yet, they stood, they fought, and they endured. And that legacy belongs to all of us. If you've made it this far, then you already understand. This is not entertainment. This is a restoration. This channel exists to tell the stories others erased. The untold colonial histories. The suppressed truths. The lives stolen by empire. And the resistance that refused to die. This is just one chapter. There are hundreds more. The children forced into colonial schools where their language was beaten out of them. The women warriors who led rebellions and were written out of the records. The healers whose knowledge was banned, then stolen and renamed as science. The villages destroyed for standing in the way of rubber, salt, cotton, and pride. All of these stories are coming. And if you felt something today, if your heart ached, if your eyes opened, if your mind started to question what you've been taught, then you are part of this work. This is your place. So don't just watch and leave. Subscribe, because this is the only way the story continues. Like the video, because these stories deserve to rise in the algorithm, not stay hidden in the dark corners of history. Comment. Let your voice be heard. Share your thoughts. Share what moved you. Share what needs to be remembered. And share this video, not just with friends, but with students, with educators, with elders. Share it with those who never heard these stories, and those who live them in silence. Because silence is what allowed this injustice to live for so long. And now, your voice helps end that silence. This channel is not about nostalgia. It's about truth. It's about justice. It's about memory. And it's about time. So stay with us. The next story is already being written. To those whose names were never spoken, we see you. To those who survived and were forgotten, we remember you. To those who watch now and choose to act, we walk with you. Until every truth is told. Until every name is known. Until history is whole. Subscribe, like, comment, share, and come back for the next story. Because this is only the beginning.